Good afternoon. Thank you so much for having me here. I want to use my time here on stage with you today to talk about the moment that we're all sharing together, this marvelous, at times absurd moment of right now. I think that we're an extraordinary moment together, not just for coffee culture, but for human culture. And it's through that lens that I want to take a snapshot of where we are today, and maybe look ahead just a little bit at where we might be going. I started Sprudge with my best friend and business partner, Zachary Carlson, in 2009, in the depths of the George Bush recession depicted in films like The Big Short. And when we started it, the thing that people would ask us, our family, friends, was, how are you going to make a living writing a website that's just about coffee? And we didn't really have a great answer for that, but in keeping with the times, there wasn't really much else going on. We were working in cafes or working as service workers, and so we just kind of did it. This is the first cover that we ever ran, and we would work 2 jobs. Like, I would work as a delivery driver. I never told my parents this. I guess they'll watch this video and find out. But I would pick up food from restaurants that didn't deliver, take it up to the top of an office tower, come back down, open my laptop, and work on Sprudge until the next order came in. My business partner would open a cafe from 6 a.m., work there till noon, go home, take a shower, and help me write the website from 1 p.m. till he collapsed from exhaustion that night. So much for lazy millennials. So 7 years later, nobody asks us, can you still make a website that's just about coffee? And as so often happens with these things, everybody was wrong. It's been my full-time job for like 5 years now, and it feels like every day there's another new website that comes out that's just about coffee. And what I would posit is that what this has sort of done is dovetailed with what I see as a wider kind of trend for people using coffee and finding coffee to be more and more appealing, not just generationally, but as this sort of like human cultural experience. What we did is we took a look to see, hey, does it just feel like this because of our perception, or is that actually true? And so using Google Trends, we took a look to see how much more people are searching for coffee now as compared to where we started. And what we found was they were searching for a lot more, like 68% more. And this is adjusted for inflation, so considering the general rise in all Google searches, coffee is being searched for 68% more often than it was when we started the site in 2009. Compare that to a couple of other kinds of terms. You see, as people have interacted differently with using Google to search for something like news, it's ebbed and flowed. Or even compared to beer, which has had this really kind of amazing cultural growth in the last few years, it's only grown about 28%. So that's coffee outpacing beer. And what I think this sort of gets to is this weird and maybe causal intertwining that's happened between coffee and this generational mandate that people my age seem to have to digitize the world around us, to take things that heretofore could have only been imagined to be a physical experience, like drinking a cup of coffee or falling in love, and turning it into a sort of digital ritual, figuring out ways to communicate that back to other people participating in those same rituals, and finding meaning through the integration of information technology into how we live the most boring parts of our everyday lives. This is one way that grouping happens. This is a hashtag which was started on Twitter in 2007 by a guy called Chris Messina, although it has like an antecedent back to the sort of early days of the internet through things like internet relay chat. The hashtag is used to group certain terms and communicate directly to other people using those terms all around the world. What starts as a fringe kind of a thing in the early days of Twitter gains a lot of cultural currency and kind of political capital through things like the Arab Spring revolutions at the beginning of this decade, and has now, here in 2016, it's in the Oxford English Dictionary. So if this is like the Dewey Decimal System, a way of sort of organizing, providing archival logic to the world, well, here's the library card. It's the computer that we all walk around with in our pockets. And I'll ask you today in the audience, who has a cell phone in their bag or in their pocket right now? You're right to raise your hand. I have one too. It's in the back. I'll check it when I get off stage. And what you sort of see with this stuff is this integration. What the phone makes it so that we can do is walk around with this stuff as part of our everyday lives and communicate our messaging and what we see and how we experience things out to that wider world in this very kind of second nature sort of a way, and produce cultural capital and express who we are and gain benefit and build a career and do all these kinds of things through digital experiences. And there's so many examples of this kind of happening. I pulled this one of a hotel in Sydney that will let you stay for free if you have more than 10,000 Instagram followers. You also check into this hotel by taking a selfie. Or this phenomenon, which is found all throughout millennial weddings, which is the idea of using a hashtag to group together photos and moments experienced at that wedding into a kind of archival logic online. And I think this is so interesting because you couldn't possibly find a more kind of primal to the very sorts of roots of who we are as human beings and how we understand the world around us and how we order our lives than a ritual like getting married. And here we are digitizing it. And I feel a little bad for putting the Robluski wedding on blast. So here's mine. Here's from my wedding. I got married a couple years ago, and we put out a sign with a hashtag on it so that people could group their moments together. And one of my favorite kind of memories of the whole experience of getting married was the next day sitting down with my new wife and looking through all the photos people took from our wedding and using that hashtag to experience those moments again. And even in researching this talk, I used the same tag to go back and find the photograph in the first place. And when we were doing this, it wasn't us saying, oh, how can we live our generational destiny by archiving the digital world around us into, new experiences. It was very intuitive. Some of it was because we saw other people doing it with their weddings, and some of it is because it just made good sense, because wedding photographers are expensive, and this was a great way to get more photos. Another kind of example of this sort of technology stuff is something like the hiking boot. I mean, this is a very basic thing, but actually represents 1,000 years or more of iterative technology, millions upon millions of dollars of research to correct this basic problem, which is that we're upright, standing apes who talk and our feet hurt. And how does this relate back to coffee? And I think what's really important to look at is this idea of saying all of the stuff we're saying is apocal technology, it's really meaningful, fringe technology that becomes mundane. It gets integrated into our everyday lives, and we don't even think about it. It's second nature now. And it happens so quick. The hashtag's like 10 years old. The iPhone is they're less than 10 years old. And it goes from being fringe technology to becoming this integrated thing into how we live our lives, and we don't even think about it. And you're probably saying, how does this, you're talking about weddings and shoes and stuff, how does this relate back to coffee? Well, I would argue that it all relates back to coffee. And one specific sort of example that I think is cool as a node to look at for how this is happening at one very specific cafe in San Francisco called Wrecking Ball Coffee, and this is the phenomenon of the hashtag pineapple selfie. So, Wrecking Ball Coffee is a coffee bar in the Cow Hollow neighborhood of San Francisco. And they opened a couple of years ago, and when they did it, they invested in putting up this really beautiful wallpaper. The wallpaper is from a print made by a company called Rifle Paper Company, and it was put up on the wall, the actual wallpaper style of it is done by a wallpaper brand called Hugie and West. So they put this up on their wall to open, and it turns into this kind of phenomenon. It becomes this kind of digital ritual where somebody comes in and they take a photo and they use that hashtag pineapple selfie, and then somebody else comes in and takes the photo and uses that hashtag pineapple selfie until it reaches kind of this critical cultural mass of 100 followers to 1,000 followers to somebody with 100,000 followers coming in and using that hashtag to group it. And people come from all around the world to do it. That's Nick Cho, one of the guys that opened that shop along with his partner Trish Rothgieb. And I asked Nick, hey, when you were doing this, did you plot this to be a kind of digital phenomenon? Did you see it coming? Was it on purpose? And he very candidly said no. And he said, we thought the wallpaper was cool. We felt it was really appealing to our demographic, which he sees as 20 to 30-something sort of digitally minded, cool women in San Francisco. And they wanted to give them a place that you could take a selfie in front of, a place where you could take a photo of yourself and sort of have that be part of the experience. And what's happened is it's sort of grown into this bigger digital ritual than they could have ever possibly predicted, where people come from all over the world, come and do this thing. They take the photo, they use the hashtag, they put their dog in front of it, they use the hashtag. And you come and participate in this thing, and what this is doing for this brand is this like incredible acceleration of their capital as a brand and their resonance as a part of how people are experiencing life in their neighborhood, in their city, as coffee drinkers, and it's all grouped around this digitization. People will just take a photo of it without themselves if they're shy. This does exist with millennials, people who don't want to take photos of themselves. People come from all around the world to do it over and over and over again, and it becomes such a phenomenon that Cho and Rothkeep have had to figure out how to like re-analogize it. So they've created these cards which you can take home with you. Think about that for a second. Here's a coffee shop that's become this digital phenomenon to the point where they've had to figure out how to analogize what they're doing so that people can take it home with them physically. Me. And where you go from there is this kind of moment of saying like, what's more important? The coffee you drink in the cafe or the photo you take of it? And in this shop, Cho confided in me, he said, people will come in now and just take a photo, they won't even order a drink. Think about that for a second. They'll go to a cafe, this sort of very old human ritual that's wrapped up in how we experience the world around us and goes back through the Enlightenment and yada yada. They'll go to this cafe to take a photo of themselves and put it on the internet. And it begs the question, what's more important, the photo you take or the coffee you drink? And how does this relate back to all these different sort of ways in our value chain? I mean, is the right selfie of the right person at a coffee farm make that coffee worth more? And here we are now integrating digital technology into our lives and doing it at this sort of almost primal level now. And that doesn't slow down. And I sort of see a couple of different ways for it to go from here. And with the caveat that nobody can really predict the future and there's this sort of unpredictability of change, I just will posit maybe two ways that I can see this integration of digital technology impacting how we think about coffee next. One of those ways is to say, hey, so as we integrate digital technology into the world around us, and as we think about, how this changes how we interact with the world, we're setting the stage for people who are going to grow up with this stuff even more as human nature. I'm talking about people growing up today with like the baby-proof iPad. And what it sort of suggests is this idea of being able to say, information technology could create this sort of next generation of consumers who are super knowledgeable about everything they purchase. And I think in some ways that's already started to kind of happen. And when you think about it in a coffee context, well, it's really interesting because notions like transparency and ethics and the rest of it aren't really that old yet in coffee. Like, coffee has this sort of bitter history that's tied into colonialism and some of the sort of questions about slave labor that have been presented here, that have been presented here at this conference. And if you're in a scenario where people are hyper informed about everything you consume, well, and if that merges with things like wearable technology or whatever, if somebody walks into your cafe and they can say, hey, I know how many slave labor hours went into that coffee, or I know how much you paid for it when you bought it at origin. Well, that creates a really interesting milieu for how companies are supposed to do business. And where I think it could be so potentially fascinating is in saying, it's not that these consumers are somehow more altruistic or more full-minded or whatever. It's just that there's more people out there gathering the information for them, doing what we've pretty much done at Sprudge over the last half decade, which is to go and find information from all around the world and put it in a place for people to access it. So if this is sort of the extension of how this information technology comes into play, I guess the way I would ask you guys to think about future-proofing would be to say, let's tear down some of those terms that intentionally obfuscate where coffee comes from. I mean, how does a term like direct trade stand up to an expose? Nobody in this room wants to be the coffee world's Mask Brothers. And I'm telling you, there's somebody out there who's willing to go and tell this story. Not because they're better people or whatever, but because there's a profit to be made, there's a name to be made. And that's what happens. So get out in front of it, future-proof yourself. Be direct about where your coffee comes from. If you use an importer or an exporter to get coffee from the other side of the world to your cafe, tell people, it's cool, it's not that big of a deal. People actually appreciate being informed about stuff like that. I know when I learned about it, I was. So that's sort of one way to think about it, and I guess that's a little bit of a humanist way to think about it. The other one is a little bit darker, and it comes informed from having a chance to talk about some of this stuff with people like Ben Wergraft, who's been a speaker here at the symposium before, and also Matt Buchanan, who for many years was a editor at the All in New York City. And they've sort of suggested to me that what's really going to happen here is the monetization of everything we do online and the kind of performance of social capital as it's tied into brand experiences. And so yes, we may be headed towards a world where there's a digital overlay in terms of how we produce things and consume things, but the creation of that digital overlay will be controlled by brands. And the brands are going to have the last say about everything we do. And what will happen with coffee in this sort of like dystopian extension of it is that it won't matter, how ethically sourced your coffee is. It won't matter how sustainable it is. All that's going to matter is the social capital you reap as a consumer by interacting with that brand. And you can kind of see the dystopian extension of this stuff if you look at things like how William Gibson talks about cyberspace and meat space, or not kind of dystopian novels like Ready Player One. But I also think you sort of see it having the groundwork set in our world right now. I mean, every time you use Facebook or Twitter or send me an angry email about this talk on Gmail or whatever, you're giving your fraction of a penny to these brands that build that digital world. Nobody's doing it altruistically. And so if you're going to future-proof for this sort of a reality, I guess my advice is to keep an army of 20-year-olds on hand so that your brand's on fleek at all times. But even that is kind of facetious because, not to be zero chill about it, but my understanding is that 20-year-olds turn into 40-year-olds as the future progresses, and there's nothing less cool than that, right? So you guys let me talk a little bit about some futurism stuff today and take this snapshot of where we're at. I think the thing that's really interesting is to look at this idea that search stuff, that uptick in Google searching, I don't think it's a fluke. I think there's a chance that as we increasingly digitize this world, that coffee is going to be the drug of choice that fuels all of it. And it ties back into coffee's ability to sort of morph its way through social experiences, from the salons of the Great Enlightenment to the cigarette smoke cafes of the Gen Xers in the 90s and clear through to now. And what's so fascinating about that is that it's comforting. It's scary to think about where all this stuff goes next, but if I have a cup of coffee, at least maybe I'll be able to deal. There's so much more stuff I could have talked about today. Perez narratives, kind of figuring out this accelerationist thing, the idea that venture capital could lead to someday a monopoly of coffee, sort of AT&T, if you will, of how coffee's distributed to high-end cafes around the world. And maybe the most important part of it, which is saying that underlying all of this are very serious questions about for whom this conversation is for, questions of class and race and access. This idea that we could be hurtling towards, or maybe already inhabiting, a sort of digital apartheid, where this conversation is only applicable to a small percentage of people on Earth. But my time is short with you today, and now, as ever, bouncing off satellites up above this room, if you'd like to speak with me more, you know where to find me.